Greetings to baristas. I have here an item some of you are no doubt familiar with, or at least have heard of. Yes, I own a copy. So when you make your counterpoints, I know exactly where you're coming from. Although I will say that in describing specific countries or incidents, these Cold War axe grinders are sometimes more restrained and balanced than the sweeping generalizations from their premises. These premises being that communism is a bloody fiasco in human history, that this is all due to the wrong-headed political economy of Marx and Engels, spinning theories in the comfort of their bourgeois intellectual armchairs without a spare thought for the human damage and carnage their brainstorms would wreak. That all communist regimes were criminal enterprises in their very essence, on principle, so to speak. They all ruled lawlessly, by violence, and without regard for human life. The fact that most communist regimes, throughout most of their existence, did no such thing, that life in communist Cuba was preferable to free Guatemala because in the latter life itself was often not possible at all, is nicely left out of this mammoth one-dimensional doorstop. It says that socialists often had an ambivalent attitude toward democracy. Well, in this age of Citizens United, such patronizing smugness is no longer possible in the empire of capital gains, and in fact it never was, because capitalism and liberal democracy have historically had at best a hooker and John relationship, at times something along the lines of a Penn State shower room, or the victim of a lone gunman in a late-night theater committing massacre by market rather than automatic rifle. And to this book's most voracious readers, its described devastation embraces all forms of socialism, real or ascribed, from Hitler to the Scandinavian welfare state and the American New Deal. OSHA and Pol Pot are thus co-authors of the same bloody page. These folks will have us believe that the antidote to the poison nostrums of Marx and Engels are found in the wisdom of Ludwig Von Mises, the Marx of Capital, and his chief disciple, his Friedrich Engels, that is, Friedrich Hayek. That this black book is a vindication of that liberty and justice for all contained in the marketplace of private property. Well, just as these authors feel justified in pinning the tail of Pol Pot under the hindquarters of Marx and Engels, we can with equal justice hold von Mises and Hayek accountable for the ideology and practice of their followers. When we do so, we find that von Mises and Hayek are responsible for upholding American racism and segregation and the use of death squads in Central America. El Salvador is one country not inserted in the pages of this book, thanks to the blowtorches, machetes, knives, and gun barrels upholding free market principles. To keep this video short, I'll use just one example. Just one disciple of von Mises and Hayek, the late Republican Senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, Jr. Jesse Helms had a long and distinguished career defending the rights of race and property in his home state and in Washington. We'll see how a leading free market partisan displayed his zeal for democracy, unlike those ambivalent collectivists. Starting out as executive director of the North Carolina Bankers Association, Helms was an early fan of von Mises' theories of finance. According to Jesse, I'm a sort of von Mises economist, and I don't see any way for us to get out of the swamps until we drain off some of the specious political and economic philosophies which have been controlling this country. To what swamps did he refer? Racial integration was the biggest in his early days. In the NCBA journal The Tar Heel Banker, he stressed that the way to beat school desegregation was to create a separate private school system. Rather than lower himself to race baiting, our genteel disciple of von Mises moved to higher ground by questioning the very concept of public education. In language that, unfortunately, is more resonant today than 60 years ago, he said he was far from convinced that public schools are the only way to make education available to our people. There's the private enterprise way, which offers the same wide horizon for enlightenment. By acceding to the very idea of state-run public schools, citizens also opened themselves to state mandate on who went to them. Private schooling was the only legal and moral way to Jesse to beat the state socialist experiment root and branch. As he put it in 1957, I prefer to oppose integration by attacking the cause rather than the Negro. Socialism caused the Southern problem. It is the club which is now being held over our heads. So there you have it from the horse's jaws as to what socialism really means and what privatization really stands for, maintaining exclusive private privilege by defeating the very idea of public social inclusion. And went on to add, if the South had been prepared to say in unity that we were ready to close our schools rather than surrender to the Supreme Court, the professional Negro and his liberal friends would have been handed the dilemma. That indeed seems to be the libertarian endgame toward education, and we're at least halfway there already. And Jesse later added, government at all levels should stop, insofar as practicable, its expansions into social areas. It is not mandatory that we have public swimming pools or tennis courts or parks. Starting to sound more than a bit familiar? Medicaid was also a step into the swamp, namely of socialized medicine. Let the old coots die if they're too poor to live. And when it came to desegregating lunch counters, he took the classic libertarian line. While it's not easy to argue with the Negro's position they should sit at the dime store lunch counter because it solicits trade from all races, they still have no right to put their social rights above the property rights of the store owners. The dime store and its lunch counter, Jesse asserted, is not a socialistic enterprise. It is not operated by the government. So there you have it again. The market and property theories of Ludwig von Mises fitting hand in glove with the preservation of racial hierarchy through economic privilege. All right, but this is all legal, bloodless, and in keeping with market contract theory. Jesse wanted nothing to do with racial violence, so how can anyone impute reactionary violence to him as a follower of Professor von Mises? Well, here's how. Right-wing oligarchs absconding with capital from El Salvador's reform government, themselves based in Miami, were introduced to a sympathetic Jesse Helms by the public relations consultancy of Mackenzie McShane Incorporated. Senator Helms, from the floor of the U.S. Senate, promoted the founding of El Salvador's rightist party, ARENA, the Alianza Republicana Nacionalista, the Nationalist Republican Alliance, and its chief candidate, Roberto da Buisson. Roberto da Buisson was the cashier-head of the Salvadoran military intelligence section on CESO, known little locally as Blowtorch Bob for his preferred interrogation techniques. They called me a psychopath, Bob once complained. That is not true. I always retain my lucidity. Bob went on to run a retail dev squad, the White Warriors Union, referring more to its political than racial coloration. He was implicated in the free contract assassination of Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero in the middle of a church mass. With the help of Senator Jesse in Washington, da Buisson and ARENA won the elections to the Salvadoran National Assembly in 1982. At the same time, Bob's henchmen were distributing wholesale carnage and retail death across the Salvadoran countryside. Da Buisson's ARENA party was sowing dissension and nullification in a very GOP manner in the national legislature, undermining all the democratic social programs imposed upon the country by the communists and their liberal minions. Why wouldn't Jesse find them so attractive? For all of his respectability, Jesse was senator from one of the most anti-labor and clan-infested states of the USA, who supported him even as he distanced himself from their violence. The same held true here, and why not? In the words of Salvadoran oligarch Alfonso Salvador, head of the El Salvador Freedom Foundation working with Senator Helms, we developed our country. We penetrated its jungles and planted coffee. Not, of course, the campesinos who actually hacked out the brush with machetes in the palms of their hands or picked the coffee beans by their own fingers. We are like the pioneers of the United States, Salvador continued. We don't want unjust privileges. We just want to return our country to a democratic regime. Obviously, folks after Jesse's own heart, from clan beatings in Robeson County to body dumps outside San Salvador. Jesse once said for the media record regarding his support for Blowtorch Bob da Buisson, if I had found even one credible link between da Buisson and the so-called death squads, I'd repudiate him instantly. Well, it's conveniently hard to find links after they're broken and destroyed and the witness has disappeared. But the evidence was in long before Jesse and Bob ever linked arms and joined hands. As Jesse said regarding black folks at home in 1963, the Negro cannot count forever on the kind of restraint that's thus far left him free to clog the streets, disrupt traffic, and interfere with other men's rights. So would the peasants of El Salvador be kept from clogging the streets except with their own dead bodies. Just as he once advocated building a wall around the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, or the University of Negroes and Communists, as he called it, to keep its moral degenerates from infecting the rest of the state, in El Salvador he could go all the way and help amputate them altogether. And all of this carnage serving as living proof of how the theories of von Mises translate into reality on the human body politic. Blowtorches and bayonets rescued El Salvador from collectivism and for unregulated market freedom, the freedom of those who have, maintained by the poverty and blood sacrifice of those who don't. Oh, who can that be now? Hello? Who? Former U.S. Senator George McGovern. Now you're calling to complain about me dissing your old Senate colleague. Oh? You just want to say that Jesse supporting da Buisson and ARENA in El Salvador to thwart Jimmy Carter and the Democrats in Congress would be like you supporting Pol Pot in Cambodia in order to mess with Nixon and Kissinger. Well, maybe, yeah, but you know that would have been impossible. Pol Pot stood opposed to core American values, and his Khmer Rouge were enemies. Death squads in Central America were friends, and freedom fighters like Ludwig and Friedrich. Such a lack of reality, Senator. No wonder you lost.